Good afternoon and welcome to our Sunday conversations with Judge Richard Gergel and Robert Rosen. I'm Alex Cohen. I'm the president of the Jewish Historical Society of South Carolina, and I'm pleased to welcome everyone who's been joining us. We're very pleased to be co-hosting this program with the American Jewish Archives. I want to thank Dr. Gary Zola and Lisa Frankel for their partnership on today's program with the Society. As usual, this program will be recorded. For those of you who join us monthly, this is a different format for us as it is a webinar, and we thank Lisa for providing the technical assistance. We have folks joining us from around the country. For those of you who may not know us, the Jewish Historical Society of South Carolina was founded in 1994 to study, preserve, and promote awareness of the history and culture of the Jews of South Carolina. We are a membership organization. I'd like to invite you to join us. The Society exists because of support from our members. Go to JHSSC.org for more information on joining, or contact our executive director, Rachel Barnett, at jhssc2020@gmail.com. If you have questions during the program, you can submit them into the chat, and if time permits, at the end of the presentations, our presenters will address them. Now, let me turn the program over to our host, Judge Richard Gergel. Welcome, Judge.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cohen, and welcome my friends from around the country who are joining us here today. I have the privilege of having my two favorite historians on with me co-hosting, Robert Rosen and Dr. Gary Zola, and it is such a privilege to partner with these wonderful historians and to talk about subjects which I think are very dear to our hearts, and it's an issue which I think the Jewish community, though it may know the broad outlines of Jewish participation in civil rights, the rich details are simply not well known. So part of our program here today, and frankly, for the last several sessions that we have been hosting, is on first with Jewish lawyers and the war against Jim Crow, and now the rabbis and the war against Jim Crow. And we can't cover everybody. We can't cover everything. So what we do is we try to focus in on a couple fascinating characters. We focus on them as examples of a story. And what we have today, first of all, we're going to deal with two groups of rabbis. One is the group of courageous rabbis who rode on freedom rides, northern-based rabbis who came south at great physical risk, and who participated in freedom rides. We're going to focus on Rabbi Dresner, and who was dubbed America's most arrested rabbi. He was a passionate advocate for civil rights. We lost him in January, and his son, Ari Dresner, is with us today and will share the story of his dad's remarkable legacy. Ari, good to have you here with us.
Thanks, Judge Gergel. I appreciate it.
And then we're going to next turn and we're going to look at Southern-based rabbis who had pulpits in the South in the 50s and 60s, and were in an extremely difficult situation. Generally, the rabbis were more progressive than their congregants, but their congregants were more progressive than their non-Jewish neighbors. And it was an incredible dilemma that these rabbis were in. It was a kind of almost impossible situation for them and frankly for their congregants. And Dr. Zola has studied this issue of these Southern rabbis, some who were remarkably courageous. And we're going to focus on two of those rabbis, Rabbi Silverman from Nashville and Rabbi Nussbaum from Jackson. But we could have talked about a lot others, but we need to do these two as just examples. And then we're going to turn and we're going to have a discussion about the dilemma of the Southern Jewish communities during this period. Who most of these communities were headed by merchants who depended on the goodwill of their customers, and there was extraordinary racial divide in these communities, and the Jews felt very much in the middle. And we're going to talk about that very candidly. But let's first turn to the issue of the freedom riding rabbis, the rabbis who came south. Tell us a little bit about the background of your dad, Avi, and how he happened to get into this world of civil rights.
Thanks, Judge. So my dad was born to immigrant parents on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. He went to a Zionist yeshiva, and I would say that that was really the beginnings of his activism, because his yeshiva, which was Eitz Chaim Yeshiva, really was sort of a fed into a feeder movement, if you will, for Habonim, the Zionist labor youth movement. And his early political activism really started there with Zionism, and then that morphed to his civil rights work. So I'm sure we'll talk about the details, but that's the general arc.
Right. And his first protest, I think his first arrest, was protesting the shit we know as Exodus, right? Not allowing the Jewish Holocaust refugees to enter the United States, correct?
Yeah, that's right. In 1947, my dad was arrested at Rockefeller Center in Manhattan outside the British Empire building, where he and a bunch of other of his labor Zionist buddies basically sat down in front and protested, refused to move. And at the time, even though he was 18, that was still considered a minor. So his mom had to come to the precinct and take him by the ear. And the story my dad always used to say was his mother grabbed him and said, "It's a shander for a Yiddish bucher." You know, it's a shame for a Jewish boy to be arrested. But of course,
it didn't stick, though, apparently.
Anything but. He wore it as a badge of honor, and that really launched him into his work down south.
So his first effort was a freedom ride to Tallahassee, Florida. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so and actually I'm going to share my screen because I've got some photos of this. Can everybody see? Yes, we're good?
Yes, yeah, we're good.
All right, great. Oops, wrong one, sorry. This I'm going to show a little bit later. Okay, there we go. Yeah, he was arrested for the first time. His freedom ride was the first interfaith clergy freedom ride, which was in June of 1961. And this photo, hopefully everybody can see, is a photo of him. You see the bus in the background. That is the Greyhound bus station in Tallahassee, Florida. My dad has just gotten off the bus after this 3-day-long freedom ride that left from Washington, D.C. and went down through Raleigh-Durham into Sumter for the South Carolinians on our call, and then to Tallahassee. And so they went from the bus station, the 18 freedom riders went from the bus station, 14 Protestant ministers, 7 white, 7 black, and 4 rabbis. And from that bus station, they went to the airport and got arrested trying to get into the airport restaurant. And so this is them at the bus station. This is my dad right in the center, just having gotten off that bus.
And just for the historical view, there have been decisions in the late 40s about interstate travel and that any type of segregation of facilities was unlawful. Apparently, the states didn't get the memo on that, and they were arresting people for what should have been lawful use of the facilities at bus stations and at airports.
Right. I mean, what they were doing was they were testing the law, and got arrested for it ultimately.
And so tell us the arc of the story from the going into the arrest at the Tallahassee restaurant. What happens from there?
So from, they were booked. This was just a quickie by my dad's civil rights standards. I think he was only in jail for a day. And then it wound up leading to, it was the first Freedom Rider case, as far as I know, that made it all the way up to the Supreme Court. And so ultimately it wended its way up through the courts and wasn't decided, I believe, until 1964, when what became known as the Tallahassee 10, which you can see right here, were ordered back to jail to finish their sentences. This is my dad up here in the top left-hand corner. And that was a 4-day stint in jail. For those of you who are astute, you will notice there are 9 here in the Tallahassee 10. One of them was away in Europe when they were called back to jail. So this was a press conference that they did, I believe, right before they went to jail for the second time, which was in '64.
But by this point, the Civil Rights Act had already passed, and what they were convicted for was now unlawful to, they were protected by federal law. So what they do as soon as they got out of jail, Avi, this is a great story.
So the Civil Rights Act was passed in July of 1964. This is now August of 1964. And so because of that Civil Rights Act, they went back to the very restaurant that they had been arrested trying to get into. You can see in the background here, the planes through the glass, and there they are eating as an integrated group, basically having reaped the fruits of their own labors. And I'm sure we'll talk about Tallahassee in a bit, but it was really I'm sorry about St. Augustine, but it was really the work of the rabbis in St. Augustine in large part that helped end the filibuster, which led to the passage of the Civil Rights Act, which led to their ability to be eating in this integrated group. So this is really quite a victory lap for them.
Yeah. And you know, we're going to talk, when we talk about the Southern rabbis, there's a lot of sensitivity by the Southern rabbis of these groups coming in, and particularly these rabbis coming in to the South from the North and creating this huge publicity they got. I mean, they got a lot of attention in these events. But I think history will tell us, in hindsight, it was these events that captured the national imagination that helped actually propel the federal legislation. So, but anyway, let's go now to the Albany campaign. That's his next effort, correct?
Right. So he starts with the Interfaith Clergy Freedom Ride in 1961. Fast forward now to August of 1962, and he goes to Albany, Georgia, with basically his Methodist counterpart, a dear friend of his, Ralph Lord Roy. And they had the opportunity when they were in Albany to meet Dr. King when he was in jail there at the beginning of August of 1962.
And they were in jail.
They went to jail a couple weeks later.
Okay.
So when they met him, they were on the outside looking in, and my dad recalls shaking Dr. King's hands through the bars of the jail cell. That was their first meeting. He had seen him before, but they never actually met. So that was the first time that they ever met. And the story my dad would always tell is that Dr. King motioned for him to be quiet for a minute, and Dr. King knocked on the wall of the cell next door, and the students began to sing.
These were students from the choir of one of the local colleges.
I think they were from Albany State College.
Yeah.
I don't even think they were in the choir. I think they were just civil rights activists.
Okay.
And they started to sing "Oh Freedom," and Dr. King motioned for my dad to come close to the bars, and he whispered to him that he did that because he didn't want the jailers, the guards, to know that he was going to be bailed out later that day. And he was bailed out later that day. And then for 4 days, my dad talked about how he would follow Dr. King around like a puppy dog to various prayer meetings and meetings with civil rights leaders and demonstrations, et cetera. And that was really a formative experience for him. And the time.
And wasn't there this moment where they were in a building together and it was surrounded, a house, and it was surrounded by a mob? Is that in Albany?
Yeah, that was in Albany, at the home of Dr. W.G. Anderson, who was the head of the local Albany civil rights movement. The home was surrounded by the White Citizens Council, which was basically the Klan without the hoods, and screaming all sorts of vile things. And Dr. King saw that my dad was a little nervous, and so he engaged him in what became the longest one-on-one conversation that they ever had, about an hour, just the two of them. And Dr. King at that time told my dad that he had attended a Passover Seder that spring, a couple months prior. And that what most impressed him was that Jews didn't try to pretend that they were all the descendants of King Solomon and King David, but that we were the descendants of slaves. We put that front and center. And he said we Negroes could learn a lesson from that. And my dad gently reminded Dr. King that not 17 years prior to that very evening in 1962, Jews had been slaves in the concentration camps and death camps of Europe. So this was not ancient history by any means for Jews. And Dr. King was very moved by that, by my dad's account.
And then after that, I believe Dr. King elicited your dad's support in bringing other clergy to Albany, correct?
Right. So 2 weeks after they first met, basically, Dr. King sent my dad back up north to recruit clergymen for what was, and to the best of my knowledge, still is, the largest mass arrest of clergy in U.S. history. 75 clergymen, unfortunately, they were all men back in the day, were all arrested in Albany, Georgia on August 28th, 1962. And this photo on the bottom, this is my dad in the white suit. He's actually standing with 74 other clergymen about to be arrested in front of the City Hall in Albany, Georgia, by this gentleman here, the Chief Laurie Pritchett. And this is my dad here in the front row raising his hand in response to Dr. King's question, who's ready to go get arrested?
And I think you actually stumbled across this picture as a child.
Yeah, so when I was about, I think 8 years old, I was doing a book report on Dr. King. And I went down to my elementary school library, and like any good kid, I just started looking through the pictures. And in less than 30 seconds, I arrived at this picture. And there's my dad in this book. Not that I didn't know about his involvement, but I didn't expect to find it in my elementary school library.
So then let's talk about the St. Augustine campaign. That's a really momentous event in the civil rights history.
Right. So this will be hard for people to see. I'll blow it up. But Dr. King asked my dad if he could arrange for a group of rabbis to come down to St. Augustine in 1964, in the summer of 64. And this is the actual letter that Dr. King sent my dad. It's the only letter that I have by Dr. King which is not signed, because as you can see from the first line, hopefully, it says, I'm dictating this letter from the St. Augustine City Jail. And so Dr. King asked my dad to bring these rabbis down, which my dad did. 16 rabbis and one layman, Al Vorspan, went down to St. Augustine and were promptly arrested at the Munson Motor Lodge. And I actually have the video of their arrest, but I don't know if you want me to show that now, Judge, or
yeah, if we could show it, it takes just a minute.
Yeah, it's about a minute long. All right, just give me a moment, please. I just got to call it up. I'm going to stop sharing for a minute and then I'll go back to it. Okay, so you're going to see my dad in the light colored suit very, very early on in like the first probably 20 seconds of the video. The whole thing is about a minute long that I'm going to show you.
You're not going to look here. You're on private property. Get out of here. Every one of you. You're on private property here. Get away from here.
On this congregation.
That was my dad being pushed.
God, our Heavenly Father, we pray that
Lie down and sweet pastor. He leadeth me beside the still. He restores my soul. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. For thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Thou preparest a table before me. The bread of life.
Come here, Rabbi.
You restores my soul.
Take your hands off. You go to jail. Like a guilty pig.
From his vantage point across the street, Dr. Martin Luther King, the Negro leader, watched the proceedings but did not take part. This is CBS News correspondent Harry Arrow in St. Augustine, Florida.
We shall over.
And, you know, Avi, the ends up, this is a national story of the arrest of all these clergy. And tell me about what Andrew Young later told you about the impact of this arrest on the Civil Rights Act's adoption.
Well, I had the opportunity to interview Andy Young back in Atlanta in June for the documentary that my sister and I are making about our dad. And I spent about 3 hours with him. And he said extraordinary things. I mean, they were friends. They really were friends. And I've had the opportunity to meet him several times over the years. But Andy said that he really credits the rabbis, and I referenced this earlier. He credits the rabbis with helping to break the filibuster against the Civil Rights Act because it was broken within a matter, I think, of a couple weeks after this arrest. In fact, I think it might have even been in a matter of a few days.
I think it was a couple of days.
It
was scandalous that all these ministers, and the reason I wanted to show the video is it's just outrageous. These guys are saying the Lord's Prayer or something, and they're being arrested. I mean, you know, it's just absolutely awful. There's also, I think it's very significant, the rabbis were in the St. Augustine jail and wrote a letter. And if you could just read a couple paragraphs from that letter that your dad and others signed, if you could, Bobby, because it's really quite moving.
We came to St. Augustine mainly because we could not stay away. We could not say no to Martin Luther King, whom we always respected and admired, and whose loyal friends we hope we shall be in the days to come. We could not pass by the opportunity to achieve a moral goal by moral means, a rare modern privilege, which has been the glory of the nonviolent struggle for civil rights. We came as Jews who remember the millions of faceless people who stood quietly watching the smoke rise from Hitler's crematoria. We came because we know that second only to silence, the greatest danger to man is loss of faith in man's capacity to act.
Incredible. The whole letter, I recommend it to folks. You can find it on the internet. That's just a deeply moving letter. Well, let's move on to the Selma campaign, which of course, as we know the setting here, there's Bloody Sunday, horrible situation where civil rights workers were brutally beaten, and Dr. King made a call for people to come and march. Thousands came, and your dad was asked to at the Edmund Pettus Bridge, the place of the attack. Your dad was actually asked to lead a prayer, and you've got a picture of him leading the prayer with Reverend Abernathy with Dr. King right at his feet there, kneeling. If you could show that.
I'm having technical difficulty. I'm trying to
welcome to the world I live in every day.
Give me a moment. I will get it. But yeah, I mean, let me just set it up, because what happened was, everybody knows about Bloody Sunday, which was March 7th, 1965. And this is now March 9th, 1965, when the rabbis and the ministers and the rabbis, they're called down to St. Augustine, to Selma by Dr. King for what he termed a minister's march, and they were asked to leave and head down, to leave the chapel where they were at, and to head down to the Pettus Bridge. And at the foot of the Pettus Bridge, and I think I've got that for you now. Just let me
Good.
Hang on. I just got to share my screen. Hold on. Sorry, I'm having trouble getting there. At the foot of the Pettus Bridge, they were asked to kneel by Dr. King, and my dad was asked to deliver the prayer right there at the foot of the bridge. And, oh, for some reason, Dr. Zola, it looks like you're sharing the screen. Do I have that right? It says, oh, there we go. All right, sorry. Now I think we've got
Four
it.
Jewish guys and technology.
Exactly.
Not a good,
I think
what's
we're
the old
doing pretty good.
what's the old
considering-
Jackie Mason joke? He says a bank robber knows, I mean, a housebreaker knows when he's in a Jewish home because the machines are going 12 on and off all over the place, but they're not to set the clock.
We've got it now, right? Everybody,
Yeah.
everybody can see this now, yes?
Yeah.
Yes.
Perfect.
Yes.
So this is the image, and Dr. King asked my dad to deliver the prayer. There's another angle of this that was in Time magazine in 1965, where you actually see the row of state troopers behind them, and these were the same troopers that beat the hell out of everybody on March 7th. And it's just a different angle of the same shot where you see them, but this is really, you know, I mean, this is one of those pictures worth 1,000 words things, I think.
Yeah. And we're going to need to move on, but let me just say of your dad's remarkable career, I think his last arrest was in his 80s. Is that correct?
No, he was not. His last arrest was in 1980.
Okay.
His last protest, his last demonstration was at the Trump inauguration. So he was indeed in his 80s for that, but he was not arrested for that.
And we lost him at age 92 just this past January, correct? And
Yeah.
you know, all our condolences go with his remarkable life. Let me move, if we could, to Dr. Zola, and let's talk a little bit about these Southern rabbis. Dr. Zola, talk a little bit about the challenges these rabbis faced in these Southern pulpits.
Well, it was a very difficult challenge, an entirely different environment than the rabbis in the North. As you know, very often Southern rabbis were quite a distance from one another, so there wasn't a kind of a community of support that existed in the large urban areas up north. And in general, they were the Southern rabbis were caught between a rock and a hard place. On the one hand, they were largely graduates of the Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati. I would say almost 85 to 90% of the rabbis in the Deep South were graduates of HUC, and they had been asked to study and learn the prophetic teachings of Judaism in their classrooms. They took this very seriously, and so when they go down to the South, especially after Brown versus Board of Education, they're motivated to try to lead their congregations in the direction of integration. Yet many of their congregants were, shall we say, also torn as to whether or not this was a good idea. And as you'll see in a minute, the Southern rabbis often felt as though they should do something, but they should do it quietly. Let the non-Jews lead the parade, and we should be in the parade, but we shouldn't be leading the parade. And then, of course, as this period progresses and the backlash to civil rights intensifies and violence begins to become the norm, or let's say, not necessarily the norm, but becomes a very frequent visitor in the South, suddenly the conditions change entirely. And we're not just talking about what's right and what's wrong, we're also talking about life and death. That goes into the mix. And we see that very often. In fact,
I mean, because I think it's largely forgotten. We know maybe from Driving Miss Daisy, we know that the Atlanta Temple was bombed, but it was not the only Jewish institution bombed in the 1950s, correct?
Right. In fact, let me say, am I sharing my screen now?
Yeah. Yes. Looks great. Yes.
Okay. So let me progress to the right after school segregation is banned because of Brown versus Board of Education. We start to see attacks in the South by really reactionaries and bigots. And as you can see, this is just 1 year from 57 to 58. And by the way, this is an incomplete list, but you start to see 57, 58, 58. And we're going to talk about number 4, which is Nashville, in a minute. But you see that, I mean, many of us remember that churches were bombed and stores, and then we also are well aware of how many people were killed and murdered in this period. And of course, the most famous of which is the tragic murder of the 3 civil rights workers, Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner. But many people are unaware of how many synagogues were bombed. And this is, again, not a complete list. Judge, you just interrupt me whenever you want, but let me go.
I mean, I think for us, from the South Carolina group, if you could go back just for a second there, the first 2 you mentioned are, of course, Charlotte and Gastonia. I think the bombers weren't very good. The dynamite didn't go off, but they found dynamite at both of those facilities. I mean, that's just for us across the border in North Carolina.
Richard, didn't we read in the Temple bombing that 10% of the bombings were of synagogues in Jewish
institutions? Yeah.
I mean, I think we, and particularly in South Carolina, because I don't think we experienced it, but this was Jewish stores and synagogues that were actually bombed. I mean, the Jews were really identified, whether they wanted to or not, in the South with the civil rights movement.
Yes. Well,
they were being blamed for it.
Yeah. Well, part of that comes, there's several elements to that. First of all, part of it comes from the fact that many people who were in Dr. King's entourage were Jews and so forth. So there were Jewish lawyers involved and Jewish donors involved and so forth. Second, we know that already in the 50s, Dr. King begins to speak in synagogues up north, just like he does in churches. And this has its effect. And then you have just the bigotry of people. They're not only bigots in the South, but in this case, we're talking about the South who I'm going to say this in a crude way, but this is the way they thought, the way they believed, that the African Americans were not smart enough, were not clever enough, were not organized enough to win their own freedom. And the only possible way that this could happen is because they were aided and abetted by the clever Jews. This is just another form of, the international Jew, who we see that to this very day. So this is all part of the story, and I probably left several other reasons out as I go. But what the bottom line is, you're right, that Jews become, even unwillingly, even those who didn't want, they get dragged into this, and then there were those who really genuinely felt that something had to be done. So let me give you an example. You saw the 4th number was the bombing of the Jewish Community Center in Nashville, Tennessee. That took place in March of 1958. This is an actual picture of how the lobby of the JCC looked. And the rabbi of that community, the Reform Rabbi, was a rabbi by the name of William B. Silverman. Rabbi Silverman was a Northerner, and by the way, there were many Northerners in the South at that time, although there were a few Southerners who went back south. But he was raised in Altoona, Pennsylvania. He was a graduate of the Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati in 1941. He spends a few years in some small congregations, and then he lands a fairly good congregation in terms of size and wealth in Nashville. And he begins, right after 1954, he begins to advocate on behalf of desegregation, and so his congregation blames him for contributing to what happened at the JCC. And when this happens, a few days later, it's Friday night, many in the community say, we don't want to have services, we don't want to gather. And Rabbi Silverman insists that there are services, and he gives an unbelievable address. Now, I want to just interject here because I know you'll all the audience is going to find this interesting. In 1967, a rabbinical student who becomes a rabbi and a very wonderful rabbi himself, he's now deceased, but in 1967, a rabbi by the name of Rabbi Alan Krauss was writing his rabbinical thesis. And he gets the idea he would like to record as many of the rabbis in 1967 as he can who participated in the South, in the American South, in the civil rights movement. And he goes and takes recordings from as many as he can find in 67. Of course, this is 10 years after 1958, but he records many, many rabbis, and we're grateful for these recordings because we hear their remembrances in their own voices. I am now going to play for you Rabbi Silverman's recollections of that event in 1967. He is now the rabbi in B'nai Yehuda congregation in Kansas City, but he's reflecting on this event. You can hear him speak yourself. So here we go. Oh, by the way, we have at the American Jewish Archives, we have the actual manuscript of the sermon that he delivers.
Which is "We Will Not Yield," right?
Against the first Friday night after the dynamiting of the Jewish Community Center. They had threatened to dynamite the temple that night. And I was urged by some members of the Board of Trustees to call off services. And I said the services will not be called off. Anybody who's frightened need not attend services. There will be adequate police protection. Now remember that as you came to services, you had to be identified by police. And you had to show some identification. But we had a packed temple. It was like Rosh Hashanah. And I don't remember the exact title of my sermon. I think it's on record, and perhaps it's in the archives there, but it was that we will not yield. Here was the point that they say, Rabbi, stick to the Bible. Well, this is the Bible. This is what the Bible teaches. Rabbi, stick to the Talmud. This is what the Talmud teaches. Rabbi, stick to Judaism. This is Judaism. And many times I carried a gun. I thought to myself, well, hey, what am I doing? You're carrying a gun. I'm not a gunsel. I'm a rabbi. My job is to teach Judaism. And I said, damn it, this is Judaism. To defend principle and to fight for principle. And not just talk about justice, but to actually work for it.
You can pick it up. He's saying here, he had to carry a gun to protect himself.
They called him the pistol packing rabbi.
Right. And because his life was threatened. And what I want to show you now is just a couple of paragraphs from that powerful sermon. And for those of you in the audience who would like to read the entirety of his sermon, the American Jewish Archives published it in an article in its journal, and you can go find it. All you have to do is go to the American Jewish Archives website, go and look at the American Jewish Archives journals, which have all been put on the website. You're looking at the issue from 2006, and there you'll find a republication with an introduction by Rabbi David Myers. It's a wonderful reproduction. I just put a couple of paragraphs because I want you to hear his rhetoric. One thing I didn't copy is he says in this speech, he says, I'm ashamed of myself. He says, I should have been even more active than I have been. He says, I've held back because of the concerns in this community. And he says, I'm ashamed of it.
But he actually was a very active guy. I mean, he was a very vocal supporter of desegregation.
But that's what he says. And then he says this. Listen, this is exactly what you're talking about, Judge. Look what he says. He says, as a Southern congregation, we need not initiate or take an overly conspicuous role in advocating integration. This is exactly what we see this again and again. But we are not only a Southern congregation, we are a Jewish congregation. And as a religious congregation dedicated to the principles of prophetic Judaism, we are morally committed to join the law enforcement agencies, the federal judiciary, the Christian clergy, and the church, and the citizens of our community in supporting decency, religious values, and the democratic rights of all the citizens of our nation. We will not yield to evil. We will not capitulate to fear. We will not surrender to violence. We will not submit to intimidation, but as Reform Jews, we will continue to speak for truth. We will continue to dedicate ourselves to social justice and to brotherhood of all men, knowing and believing that all men are created in the divine image, and this includes Negroes as well as Caucasians.
Dr. Zola, if you would provide, if your staff would provide to Ms. Barnett the speech, we'll post it on our website. It's a beautiful, beautiful speech.
Yeah, it really is. And then later, when he moves, after he moves to Kansas City, this is a picture I took from, he met with, Truman was very friendly with the community there. He writes a book, and his book is called Basic Reform Judaism. It was published in 1970. I won't read it now, but what it says in a nutshell here is, he talks about that the most important thing that Reform Judaism has to offer the Jewish people is its commitment to being involved in making the world a better place. That's his basic message. So Silverman.
Yeah. Let me say about Rabbi Silverman. He was a very charismatic figure and a very skilled, polished rabbi. And he had big congregations, obviously Nashville, Kansas City. These were big major congregations. But many of these rabbis were in these small 100, 125 member congregations in the rural South, correct?
Yes, and that leads us to the next person we wanted to talk about, and that's Rabbi Perry E. Nussbaum. Rabbi Nussbaum is born in Canada, goes to the Hebrew Union College. He's ordained in 1930, and he can't get a job because Rabbi Nussbaum's known for being a very prickly personality, and he can't land a job in North America. So his very first pulpit is in Melbourne, Australia, and he's booted out of Melbourne after 1 year. Later in life, he would write about his time in Melbourne, paraphrasing Shakespeare. He'd say, "I came, I saw, I failed," and
I think you're being tactful in describing his personality, but go ahead.
Well, I don't know if you knew him, Mr. Rosen, but
I read about him.
Yeah, but he this is very, people who knew him have told me I nailed him. I've never met him. He died before I had a chance to meet him, but people who knew him actually said I've nailed his personality. At any rate, Nussbaum has 8 different pulpits before he lands in Charleston. It may be
Jackson.
I meant in Jackson. Forgive me. I'll tell you a cute story that I wrote about in my writing about him. He's forlorn because he keeps losing pulpits, and one of his classmates says to him, "Listen, Meyer Lovett is retiring from Jackson. I've talked to him. I spoke at his farewell party. He told me it was the easiest pulpit in the whole world." He said, they have only Friday night services. There's hardly a religious school there. He said, "Perry, try out for that pulpit. Nobody wants to go down south. You'll be sipping mint juleps for the rest of your career." So he tries out for this pulpit and he gets it. Unfortunately for Nussbaum, it's in keeping with his whole career. I'm not exaggerating. He lands in Jackson, Mississippi 5 weeks after Brown versus Board of Education. And now he is the rabbi, this northerner who can't hold a pulpit. He is the rabbi of the capital city of Mississippi at the time when Mississippi's about to burn up. And so let's go to 1967. He's been there since 1954, but in 1967, we're going to see some things that are really remarkable. Before we get to 67, though, here's a picture of Nussbaum on the pulpit of the new synagogue that is still standing there, but it was dedicated in 1967 in June when he was the rabbi. And there he is on the bema of that pulpit. And Nussbaum begins to have problems with the community for his outspokenness about civil rights. This judge, you're going to find this interesting. You see where I've circled at the bottom?
Yes.
I cut out a little of it, but you see it's the state archives, and this is the files of the White Citizens Council, and they have a whole folder on Nussbaum. What's in this folder? He sponsored a Jewish teachers conference in conjunction with B'nai B'rith, and they were, because B'nai B'rith was a national organization, they were looking at him already in the early 1960s.
Right, and also his crime was he visited Jewish freedom riders who were stuck at Parchman Prison, one of the worst prisons in the United States. They sent them like they're murderers or something, and he goes and visits them weekly, correct?
Exactly. But that is really what pushes him very deep into the civil rights movement, because parents of the freedom riders, many of whom were college students and young people, parents wrote to Nussbaum and praised him and called him a hero, and that sort of fed his courage. I think everybody knows the tragic story in 1963 of the shooting death of Medgar Evans in Jackson. And I just want to show you, because although we describe Nussbaum as a very brittle and tactless human being, when this happened, he immediately wrote a letter to his beautiful widow. And I have that letter in the American Jewish Archives, and I want to read it to those who are on the website, because this is the other side of Nussbaum that needs to be remembered. He writes this: "This has been a day of supreme tragedy. I know the anguish that is yours and your children's now, and nothing can compare to it. But please believe me, I am completely sick at heart. A young man so sincerely dedicated to a great mission, to be so cruelly struck down in the prime of his life. I pray to the Lord that you will continue to have the same courage in the days ahead that you must have had these past years. I pray for your children. May they mature proud in the knowledge that their father was a tireless and fearless in behalf of the American dream. And someday," he writes, "when the history of these times in Mississippi and Jackson is honestly and fully set down, the name of Medgar Evers, martyr, will be a symbol and an example of those human qualities which, God help us, so few now display. For whatever purpose you want to put it, please accept the enclosed check in memory of your husband."
Yeah, I mean, he is incredibly courageous. And what's sort of interesting is politically, he gets himself so isolated because on one hand, he's, passionately becomes engaged over time in the civil rights efforts. On the other hand, he is attacking the national movement for the rabbis coming south and the UAHC speaking out on civil rights.
Yeah, he seems, he seems almost to gain strength from being at the center or the vertex of the storm. He argues with his congregants. His congregants tell him to be quiet, don't talk so much. And he says, you can't resign from Judaism. And then he argues with his colleagues up north. And, and he tells his colleagues up north, you guys have such big mouths. Why don't you come on? There's a lot of pulpits down in the South. Why don't you come down here and work like I am? Which, of course,
well, Gary, don't forget about the bombing of his house and the attempt on his life.
Okay, well, here you go. You want to. So the judge mentioned that when the Freedom Riders begin to come to Jackson, they get arrested, and Nussbaum goes to visit them on his own. And when that happens, these letters inspire him, and he becomes more and more involved in the movement, and he organizes an interracial Ministerial Association in Jackson. The result is in June of 1967, maybe a few weeks after the dedication of this brand new temple, they bombed the temple. This is 1967 in June. This is a picture of that. And then this is a picture of Nussbaum inside the bombed temple. He's looking at his office. You can see the dust and all the paint, everything's fallen off the wall. The next day, there's an organized multi-religious support assembly in front of the temple. And then this is Nussbaum speaking at that event. And then 2 months later, in November of 1967, the KKK bombs his house while he's sleeping in it at night. And
they're playing for keeps.
They're playing for keeps. And this is a very poor picture, but somebody captured at night the rabbi and his wife. You can see the look on her face, as poor as the picture is, of them trying to escape. Now, I'm going to conclude this on Nussbaum by playing a few days after this in November, a day or two later, the local news reporters, the television, they want to interview Nussbaum. And they do so, and Nussbaum doesn't want to answer questions. He says, I'm going to deliver the sermon that I planned to give on Friday night, that I was going to give I want the people of Mississippi to hear what I have to say. And now you'll hear in his own voice the kind of man he was. And this is what he says, I'm sure to the horror of many of his congregants who have to listen to this the next day. So you'll hear this right now.
We give thanks to God, of course, for many things, but the delicacies of the table can become gall and wormwood when blessings are not assessed in terms of stewardship, when liberty is not recognized as a challenge to the responsibility of preserving it. The psalmist sings, "Let the peoples give thanks." The deeply concerned American pathetically says, and I have had many deeply concerned Americans come to me today, again, the second time in 2 months. Let all the decent people stand up to bigotry and racism and demand that authorities root out the vicious and the despicable. These are not American. This is what I'm saying as a rabbi. We leave it to other clergymen to declare if they are Christian.
Yeah, I can't help but wonder, if that last line he just inserted, I doubt that he was going to say that from his pulpit, but that's typical of Nussbaum. In other words, he says, I'll tell you as a rabbi, I'm saying this, that these people are not Americans. And then I think, he throws in this line, I'll let the Christians,
Well, there is the story that many times the people who take the first bullet are characters, right? They're iconoclasts, they're different. They may not have the greatest social skills in the world, but they have courage, and they have the courage of conviction.
Yeah.
And,
Richard, I think that we're really lucky for this book. And, Krauss, this is the book, right? To stand aside or stand alone. And, one of the things we were going to do, we always try to do with the South Carolina Jewish Historical Society, is try to find a South Carolina rabbi as part of the story. And I Googled Bert Padal, who of course was my rabbi at the temple. And, Krauss also interviewed him and wrote an article about him, but for whatever reason, it's not part of this book. And Gary, maybe you know why, but the article itself is online. And it's a very long.
But Padel actually had some of the characteristics of Nussbaum. He was a sort of prickly personality.
Exactly.
But he was an incredibly courageous guy. And let me just kind of delve with this other issue, which is sort of raised by all this. These, particularly in these communities like Jackson, Mississippi, Hattiesburg, et cetera, the congregants are, many of them are merchants. They're in the public. They serve the public. They need the goodwill of the public. They're socially, Jews are kind of like an ambiguous spot in American Southern society. And here they are, Robert. They're being thrust into by their rabbis, by the American Jewish movement. They're being thrust into the middle of this fight that they fear.
Right. Well, Krauss, this was really sort of an education. Richard and I are always saying that we think we know stuff, and then we get involved in these subjects and we learn things. I mean, for example, I never knew there was a pistol packing rabbi in Nashville, and Nussbaum, despite his personality issues, was a very brave guy. I mean, a very brave guy. And so, I always thought these Southern rabbis were sort of quiet and, didn't want to rock the boat. And
that's true for some.
That's true for some. But these others are very outspoken. One of the things Krauss does, and there's nothing that gives me more pleasure than to laud the work of another historian when you see good work. He said, he calls one half of the book "In the Land of the Almost Possible," which is Mobile, New Orleans, and Atlanta. And he calls the other half of the book "In the Land of the Almost Impossible," Birmingham, Hattiesburg. And there are all these rabbis who face these crises in different ways, some more quietly, some not so quietly. And, in Googling Bert Padal, for example, our own society, we published this, the Jewish Historical Society published in the spring of 2009, Sally Brebart's recollections of Bert Padal. And, that's a whole other story for another night. But, KKBE, he was trying to move the temple forward a little faster in the area of social justice than apparently the leadership wanted to go. But, it's everybody's got
Robert, what was interesting about Padal, according to the articles Krauss and Solly wrote, was that the congregation itself, majority supported him. He had some very conservative members of the board, right? And it wasn't like he was getting ready to be fired. He just thought life was too short to have this kind of solace in his life.
And Krauss's article really goes into all the details of all the names and personalities that we can't get into on this broadcast. But I think what we see with the Southern rabbis is they're sort of damned if they do and damned if they don't. I mean, they want to do the right thing, and many of them do and take risks, and others are very cautious, very cautious.
And let's look at let's for a second. It is easy to be harsh about the Southern Jews. Mm-hmm. I mean, you look at Cy Dresner and you say, now that's who I identify with, or Rabbi Silverman, that's who I identify with. But these folks sitting in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, and in Jackson, Mississippi, let's just face it, they've had 3 civil rights workers assassinated, 2 of them Jews. They've had the home and synagogue of the rabbi in Jackson blown up. They've had synagogues in multiple southern cities blown up. There was a merchant in Mississippi wrote somebody in one of the rabbis outside the South and said, "You're going to get us killed here in Mississippi." And I think all of us would want to be Cy Dresner or William Silverman. I mean, we all look back and they say that's what we'd want to be. But can we really look down on these people who, had businesses and lives and children and lived in communities which were basically lawless societies? Right. Nobody was getting, Gary, did they ever prosecute anybody who blew up these temples and stuff?
Well, in some cases, Judge, it took years and years.
Right. I mean, like the murder of the children, the 4 little girls. Right. That happens 25 years later, Right.
What you're saying, Judge, is right. I find that even the most ardent spokespeople in the Deep South, rabbinic spokespeople, they were sort of Janus faced. They were facing in 2 directions at once. On the one hand, inside of their own congregations, they would speak about the importance of prophetic Judaism, and especially the graduates of HUC, because it was like mother's milk to them. That's how they studied Bible and so forth. On the other hand, when they faced outward, they were being pastors to their own congregation, and they were trying to protect people. And that's the one thing I've said to you, Judge, when we talked, that Dr. Marcus, I never forget how he was very tranquil about so many things, but he didn't.
Let's just remind people who Dr. Marcus is. Jacob Rader Marcus is the greatest legend of American Jewish history. He's the greatest scholar, and he was your mentor, and you succeeded him. So tell this conversation that he had.
Well, he once, I heard him say to a scholar who was writing on the South, who made a presentation in front of Dr. Marcus, he was being very critical of the rabbis in the South during this period about which we're speaking this evening. And Dr. Marcus really rarely spoke in an intemperate way, but he said to the scholar, don't ever do that to the Southern rabbis. He said, you can't possibly understand the complex situation they were in, that their circumstances were very difficult, and they were protecting their own people. Because this was not make-believe. People were getting killed. People were bombed. I told the story to the judge. People listening will find it interesting. Nussbaum wrote in his papers somewhere that when he was going down to visit these people in Parchman Prison, the chief of police of Jackson took him aside and said to him, and he writes it this way, he said, "Rabbi, why do you want to spend so much time with those crackpots who are in jail?" He says, "Rabbi, if you keep doing what you're doing, I'm not sure I'm going to be able to protect you." Well, we can smile about that now 50, 60 years later, but I'd like to know how many of us would just let that, when the chief of police, says something like that.
And he was right. He was right. Yeah. They blew his house up. I mean, with him inside. And,
right.
and in Hattiesburg, Rabbi Martin Bond, he had the former mayor come to him, who was head of the White Citizens Council, and he tells him the story. He says, "Listen, Rabbi, I was at a meeting and they were saying we needed to bomb your temple. But I said, oh no, it's the Jews here are fine. It's the rabbi, we need to get his house." And the rabbi Martin Bond brings out a notepad and said, "Let me write this down so I can make sure I tell it accurately to the FBI."
Richard, they spied on him. I mean, they had a guy outside of his house writing down everywhere he went and what he did. I mean, he's in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, right?
His name was Charles Mantonband, Mantinband, and Mantonband Mantonband in a way made Nussbaum look diplomatic in terms of, because Mantonband actually invited African-American clergy into his home. And this,
Richard, you ought to mention the rabbi in Columbia. You and I have.
Yeah, Rabbi David Gruber had been mentored, he felt, by Rabbi Wise and Stephen S. Wise. He was a passionate a believer in the philosophy of Rabbi Wise. Many of his sermons when I was growing up referenced Rabbi Wise and the cause of human justice. And the rabbi taught. And Rabbi Gruber, David Gruber, taught at Benedict College, an African-American college. Some congregants said, "Well, why aren't you teaching at university?" He said, "Well, I'm going to teach at Benedict. I mean, freedom of the pulpit. I'm going to do it my day off. That's where I go." These guys, but was he out there leading marches and stuff? He was not. That wasn't what he did. But within his congregation, there was no secret about his belief. And let me say this. The congregants were more conservative on these issues than their rabbi. But the Jews were generally more progressive on race than the non-Jews in the South. Ari, is that fair?
I think so. Like I always say, my reading of this period is you had in any congregation in the what we would call the Deep South, you'd have maybe 10% of the congregation that wanted to be very aggressive and active in terms of advancing social justice causes and integration. You would have maybe 10 or 15% on the other side who were out and out bigots and just, were against it. And then you would have this middle ground of the congregation that wanted to be gradualists, to one degree or another, meaning they wanted to see things go in a progressive direction, but they were worried about too fast, too much, too aggressive, and there were varying degrees of that. And the rabbis, that's who they played to. They wanted to bring that crowd along, but not to get so far ahead of them that they lost their job.
I saw somebody asked, one of the chat questions was, how many rabbis lost their pulpits over civil rights? Some did, obviously.
Some did, yes, some did. Yeah, but the what was sort of a bulwark against that for the person who asked that question is that in those days, most of these places were not viewed as plum pulpits. And therefore, and the Southerners knew that. So it was, in other words, if Jackson, Mississippi felt that they could have gotten rid of Nussbaum,
they would have.
And they would have. They had to tolerate a lot, and especially, I mean, you're talking about places like Cleveland. Cleveland, Mississippi had its own rabbi, and these guys stayed for many years, although they always used to complain at their meetings that all of them had one-year contracts, year after year after year.
It was a, do we have other, let me just ask Lisa, do we have any other questions that we had in the chat that we haven't addressed here?
I think you've addressed most of them. There was a lot of comments about people who'd had sort of firsthand experiences, either with interviews or things like that. And then there's a lot of very specific questions, so I think they could be answered offline.
Lisa, pardon me, yeah. Lisa, I did see someone asked Avi how the congregation over the years took to your father's.
Yes, I saw that. That's a good question.
I think that's an interesting question. I bet people would like to hear that.
Well, I think that what you just said, Dr. Zola, is probably accurate, but I would just add simply the point that my father's rabbinic philosophy was that if your congregation isn't constantly trying to fire you, you're doing something wrong. And he, that wasn't a slogan for him. That was that was emis. I mean, that was the truth. The other point that I want to harken back to is that there was no place safe during this period of time. With all of the arrests down south, all of the jailings, all of the actions down south, the one place my father was beaten by the police during the civil rights movement was 10 minutes away from his home and his pulpit in Springfield, New Jersey, when he was protesting in Newark, New Jersey. He had a bullet hole through the rear window of his car when I was an infant for his outspokenness against Vietnam and school prayer. So, there are no lack of extremists anywhere in this country. I think January 6th showed us that. And so while he always made the point that he got to go home and got to go back north, and the real heroes were the ones who had to live this day in and day out, particularly the African Americans, because the whites, Jewish, though they may have been, could pass as white. They were white, right? So that's a whole different ball of wax. But the other thing I will say is that every time my dad went south, he made sure, though he didn't wear a yarmulke, in his normal day-to-day life, every time he got arrested, he put that yarmulke on, and he might as well have put a target on his head or a target on his back for doing that. And while it's true he got to go home, this violence followed people all over this country, and it wasn't just the Schwerner, Cheney, Goodman. And by the way, as a little aside, my dad married Mickey Schwerner's widow because she married, unfortunately, after he was murdered several years later, she married a boy from my father's congregation in Springfield, and he officiated at that wedding. So that's another little interesting.
Well,
but Richard, I think we ought to mention the fact that we've been bragging about the Reform Rabbis, but in fact, the Conservative Rabbis also showed up, right, Gary? I mean,
It's Selma. I mean,
and-
Rabbi Abraham.
Abraham Joshua Heschel, who we're going to talk about next month, was Orthodox, right? So, I mean, this is not, the Reform rabbis didn't have a monopoly on social justice. Am I right?
Well, you're right, and there were a number of JTS grads in the South. For example, in Houston, there's a famous rabbi by the name of Malev, who was also very outspoken, and a number of others. But the fact is, the reason I'm emphasizing it, I'm sure, is because I'm a partisan. And number two is that it's just a fact that in the Deep South, the vast majority of the rabbis serving these little pulpits were from Hebrew Union College, and part of the reason was, you had to be willing to live in those places where you couldn't easily get the kind, where let's put it this way, where halachic life was very difficult, and so that's just the fact. I'd also like to put a plug in, if anybody's listening who knew Rabbi Krauss. Rabbi Krauss was a friend of mine, and his rabbinic thesis, I would say, was used more than almost any other rabbinic thesis that I've ever seen in history at the Hebrew Union College. And the tragedy of it all, it's really a tragedy, is that Rabbi Krauss retired with the purpose of always wanting to publish that book that you held up. And he fell ill with a virulent form of cancer and perished before he could even finish it. So that book was finished by his children, and also Mark Bauman from Atlanta.
Yeah,
and it's a treasure.
Yeah, let me say a couple of things here. This is I want to thank y'all. This has been an extraordinary discussion. We're going to continue it in March. Rabbi Zola is going to return with Robert and me, and we're going to focus on three fascinating figures. One is Rabbi Jacob Rothschild in Atlanta, and we're going to make a deep dive into the temple bombing. It's a story you think you know until you learn how much you don't know. We're going to feature the remarkable speech of Rabbi Joachim Prince at the March on Washington. Everybody remembers Dr. King's extraordinary speech. The speech immediately before him from Rabbi Prince is also a remarkable speech, and Dr. Zola is going to have a video of excerpts from that so we can hear it. And then, as Robert mentioned, we're going to feature the recent biographer of Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, probably the most important Jewish theologian of the 20th century. This new biography, A Life of Radical Amazement, Julian Salazar, I believe from Princeton, and Robert's going to lead the interview of him. He's going to join us. So three remarkable rabbis in this whole fight against Jim Crow. And we're going to come back.
He's the rabbi, remind everybody, he's the rabbi that looked like Moses himself at the March on Selma.
And he's marching a couple of people down from Dr. King. And I will just give a little plug to Rabbi Dresner. He helped recruit him to come to Selma. And let me just make one more plug. Avi is working hard with his sister on a documentary presently titled "The Rabbi and the Reverend," on the relationship between Rabbi Dresner and Dr. King. And more information about that can be found on our website. You can click that and get more information. And I'm sure Avi is glad to give you additional information if you need it. Okay. So, folks, we've run a little over, as we often do, because we're so enthusiastic about this subject.
There were a bunch of Jews talking to me.
And of course, we had technology, four guys and one light bulb, that joke. And thank y'all so much. It was a wonderful discussion. And March 27th, Sunday, March 27th, 5:30, join us. We're coming back again to continue this extraordinary discussion on the rabbis and the war against Jim Crow. Thank you, everybody. Everyone be safe.